How did helping a friend put you in the hospital? My friend Isabel begged me to help her scrape lead paint from her mom's old bedroom before her brother Ian got home because their dad was moving into that room tomorrow. She'd been trying to make the house safe since their mom died 2 months ago, but Ian wouldn't let her change anything. He'd already given her a black eye for trying to throw their mom's moldy curtains. We got to the house around noon, and Isabel's hands were shaking as she unlocked the door. The bedroom walls were peeling, paint chips everywhere, and Isabel said, "Dad's doctor said the lead exposure could kill him with his lung condition. We have to finish before Ian gets here." I told her we'd be done by 3 to be safe. We put on masks and started laying plastic sheets, then began scraping the toxic paint off the walls. Every car that passed outside made Isabel freeze and check the window. She kept saying, "That sounded like his truck," even though it was only 1 o'clock. I tried to keep her calm, talking about how we were literally saving their dad's life, but she couldn't stop checking her phone every 2 minutes. At 1:30, she dropped the scraper and ran to the window because she heard a truck door slam, but it was just the neighbors. Her whole body was trembling, and she said, "Maybe we should stop." This was a bad idea. I convinced her to keep going, saying we were over halfway done, but I was getting nervous too because she'd shown me pictures of what Ian had done to her last time. We got most of the dangerous paint scraped and were sealing the walls when Isabel's phone buzzed. Her face went white looking at the text, and she said, "Ian's foreman just said he left the site. He's been drinking. He'll be here in 20 minutes. It was only 2:30, and we still had toxic paint chips everywhere that needed to be bagged properly. I said we should leave immediately, but Isabel was crying, saying their dad would die if he breathed this stuff in with his condition. We worked frantically, stuffing paint chips into hazmat bags, trying to vacuum the dust, not caring about being neat anymore. Isabel kept checking the window, her breath coming in short gasps, lead paint dust on our clothes despite the protective gear. At 2:40, she heard an engine and looked out and screamed, "That's his truck!" Ian's pickup was pulling into the driveway, and even from upstairs I could see him stumble getting out. Isabel tried to hide the hazmat bags, but there was nowhere to put them, and we were both covered in paint dust. Heavy footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. Isabel grabbed my arm so tight it hurt and whispered, "Don't say anything. Let me talk." The bedroom door slammed open and Ian stood there, 6'4", still in his work clothes, reeking of beer and sweat. His eyes went from us to the scraped walls to the bags of lead paint on the floor. His face turned dark red and a vein started pulsing in his neck. "What the fuck did you do?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. Isabel tried to explain that the lead paint would kill Dad, but Ian crossed the room in 2 steps and slapped her so hard she fell into the paint chips we hadn't bagged yet. I yelled at him to stop, but he turned on me and said, "Get out of my house." I told him I wasn't leaving without Isabel, but he grabbed a hammer from his tool belt and said, "You want to test me?" Isabel was trying to get up, toxic paint dust in her hair, blood running from her nose. Ian kicked the hazmat bag across the room, lead chips flying everywhere, and screamed, "You ruined her room! You ruined everything!" He stood in the doorway, blocking our only exit, still holding the hammer. Isabel was crying and saying Dad would die from lead poisoning, but Ian grabbed her by the throat and slammed her against the scraped wall. I tried to pull him off, but he swung the hammer at my head, and I barely ducked in time, feeling it whistle past my ear. He had Isabel pinned with one hand on her throat and raised the hammer with the other. "You want to erase Mom? I'll erase you." I grabbed the scraper and slashed at his arm, making him let go of Isabel. She gasped for air and tried to run past him, but he caught her hair and yanked her back, throwing her into the bags of toxic paint. He came at me with the hammer and I backed up, but there was nowhere to go in the small room. He swung and I felt it graze my shoulder, sending shocking pain down my arm. Isabel grabbed his leg and he kicked her in the stomach, making her curl up gasping. He stood over her with the hammer raised and said, "You're just like Dad. Couldn't wait for her to die." Probably helped her along. Isabel sobbed that she was trying to save Dad, but Ian brought the hammer down, stopping just inches from her head, punching a hole in the floor. "Next one won't miss," he said. I tried to tackle him, but he was too big and threw me into the wall, my head hitting hard enough to see stars. Through blurry vision, I saw him standing over Isabel with the hammer raised again, his face twisted with grief and rage and alcohol, and she was begging him to remember that Mom wouldn't want Dad to die from lead poisoning. He was crying now too, screaming about how Isabel had killed their mom by putting her in hospice, how she'd given up on her. The hammer was shaking in his raised hand, and I couldn't get up fast enough and Isabel was trying to crawl away, but he planted his boot on her back, pinning her down. "Mom's room stays exactly how she left it," he said, and started bringing the hammer down. I rolled hard to my right just as the hammer came down, and the floor exploded where Isabel's head had been, wood splinters flying everywhere. Isabel was already scrambling on her hands and knees toward the door, lead paint chips sticking to her clothes, while Ian stood there with snot running down his face, tears mixing with the sweat. He yanked the hammer out of the floor and swung it sideways at me, missing by inches as I kept rolling. Isabel made it to the doorway, but Ian spun around and brought the hammer down again, punching another hole in the floor right behind her feet. She let out this terrible scream and kept crawling while I grabbed a paint roller and threw it at his head. It bounced off his shoulder and he turned back to me, raising the hammer high, his whole body shaking with rage. That's when we heard the sirens, faint at first, but getting louder fast, and Ian froze with the hammer still raised above his head. His eyes went wide and he looked at the window, then back at us, then at the window again. Isabel used that second to crawl past him into the hallway while I lunged forward and grabbed his ankle with both hands. He stumbled forward, almost falling, and the hammer slipped from his grip and clattered across the floor. Ian kicked backward hard and his boot caught me right in the ribs, sending this sharp pain through my whole chest. He bent down to grab the hammer again, but now there was pounding on the front door, loud and official sounding, and someone was shouting something about police. Ian stood there breathing hard, looking between us and the stairs, his face all twisted up with confusion and rage and fear. The pounding got louder, and then we heard this huge crash as the front door got kicked in. Boot steps thundered up the stairs fast and heavy, while Ian backed up against the wall and dropped the hammer. 2 cops burst through the bedroom door with their guns out, screaming for everyone to get on the ground right now. Isabel and I dropped flat immediately, my face pressed against the lead paint dust on the floor. Ian started waving his arms around, yelling that this was his house, his mother's room. They had no right to be here. One cop kept his gun on Ian while the other moved closer, telling him to get down. Get down now. Ian took 1 step forward, still yelling about his rights, and both cops rushed him at once. They slammed him into the wall so hard a picture frame fell and shattered. It took both of them to wrestle him down, one on each arm, while he kept struggling and screaming about his mother's room. They got him face down, and one cop put a knee on his back while the other pulled his arms behind him. The cuffs clicked on and Ian was still yelling, but it was muffled now with his face pressed into the floor. More people came up the stairs and suddenly there were EMTs everywhere. One knelt next to Isabel, who was coughing and spitting up blood, her throat already turning purple where Ian had grabbed her. They put this collar thing on her neck and rolled her onto a board real careful, strapping her down while she kept trying to talk but could only make these raspy sounds. Another medic shined a light in my eyes and felt the back of my head where it hit the wall, his fingers coming away with blood on them. He asked me questions about what day it was and who the president was while checking my shoulder where the hammer had grazed me. Someone went downstairs and found Isabel's dad in his chair, wheezing bad and confused about all the noise. The EMT took one look at him and the lead dust everywhere and called for oxygen right away. They put a mask on his face and helped him to his feet, but he could barely walk, kept asking what was happening. Where was Isabel? A third ambulance pulled up outside and more EMTs came in with a stretcher for him. The cops were taking pictures of everything, the holes in the floor, the blood on the wall, the lead paint chips scattered everywhere, the hammer. They bagged the hammer as evidence and took pictures of Isabel's throat and my head and shoulder. The ride to the hospital was all sirens, and the EMT kept asking me to stay awake, stay with him, while my head felt like it was splitting open. In the emergency room, they put Isabel in the bed next to mine with curtains between us, but I could hear her trying to talk to the nurses. Dr. Gita Bar came in and ordered CT scans for both of us right away, plus blood tests to check how much lead we'd been exposed to. She was real gentle, taking pictures of every bruise and cut with this special camera, measuring them with a ruler, writing everything down. She asked me to tell her exactly what happened, speaking slow and clear into a recorder. They wheeled me to the CT machine and made me lie still while it spun around my head, then brought me back to the ER where Isabel was getting her scan done. Detective Bennett Rollins showed up while we were waiting for results, this older guy with a notebook who pulled a chair between our beds. He was patient, letting Isabel write her answers since she couldn't talk well, having me go through everything from when we got to the house at noon. He wanted every detail about the paint scraping, when Ian arrived, what he said, what he did with the hammer, how many times he swung it. Rollins wrote it all down and had us both sign statements even though Isabel's hand was shaking so bad her signature looked wrong. Then Francine Pratt from Domestic Violence Services came in, this woman with kind eyes who sat next to Isabel's bed and talked soft about safety planning and restraining orders. Isabel kept writing the same thing over and over on the paper Francine gave her, that she just wanted to save her dad. She just wanted him to be safe from the lead paint. Tears were running down Isabel's bruised face and onto the paper, smearing the ink. The detective's phone started buzzing and he checked it while Francine kept talking to Isabel about what would happen next. Rollins held up his finger and answered, then started writing fast in his notebook while someone on the other end talked loud enough that we could hear a man's voice but not the words. He hung up and told us that was Ross Bradford, Ian's foreman from the construction site, confirming Ian had left work drunk around 2:30 after drinking during his lunch break. Ross had tried to stop him from driving, but Ian grabbed a wrench and threatened to bash his head in if he didn't back off. The detective wrote down everything Ross said about Ian being drunk at work before and having anger problems on job sites. A new doctor came in wearing scrubs and introduced himself as Abraham Zhao, saying he needed to check on Isabel's dad right away because of the lead exposure. He examined their dad for about 20 minutes, checking his breathing and asking him questions he couldn't really answer because he kept getting confused. Dr. Zhao came back to us looking worried and said the lead dust in that house could kill someone with lung problems like their dad had. He wrote orders for the nurses to move him somewhere safe immediately, not back to that toxic house. Isabel started crying harder, and Francine rubbed her back while she wrote on the paper that she didn't know what to do, because Ian was still her brother, and their dad needed both his kids. Francine explained real gentle that it didn't matter if Isabel wanted to press charges or not, because the state would prosecute anyway when someone almost dies from domestic violence. The detective nodded and said with the evidence they had, the hammer, the photos, our statements, plus Ross calling about Ian being drunk, the prosecutor would definitely file charges. Isabel kept shaking her head and writing that this would tear their family apart, but Francine said the family was already torn apart when Ian started hitting her. My head was pounding so bad I could barely focus, but I heard the detective say Ian would probably make bail by tomorrow since he had no record. That made Isabel grab my hand so tight it hurt, and she looked at Francine with huge, scared eyes. The detective said not to worry because we'd get a protective order, but I could tell Isabel didn't think a piece of paper would stop her brother. The next morning, they discharged me with papers about concussion protocol, telling me to watch for headaches, dizziness, confusion, and to come back if anything got worse. My shoulder was wrapped up tight and they gave me pills for the pain, but warned me not to take too many because of the head injury. The discharge nurse handed me a stack of papers, including the bill estimate, and I almost threw up when I saw it was already over $3,000, just for the emergency room visit and CT scan. Isabel was getting discharged too, but they were keeping her dad for observation because of his breathing problems and confusion from the lead exposure. We went back to the house with a police escort to get some clothes and medicine for Isabel's dad, and that's when the lead hazard inspector showed up with his testing equipment. He spent 2 hours taking samples from the walls, floor, and air, then put bright yellow tape across the bedroom door with big warning signs about toxic hazard. The inspector told us the room was completely unsafe for humans until professional lead abatement was done, and when he gave us the estimate, Isabel broke down sobbing because it was $15,000 minimum. Francine had followed us to the house and she started making calls right away, arranging for a locksmith to come change all the locks that afternoon. She also connected Isabel with emergency victim assistance funds that could help with temporary housing and some of the lead cleanup costs. While we waited for the locksmith, Francine pulled 2 small cans of pepper spray from her bag and showed us exactly how to use them, making us practice the motion over and over. She said to aim for the eyes and spray in a sweeping motion, then run immediately and call 911. The locksmith changed every lock on the house and gave Isabel 3 sets of keys, telling her not to give any to family members who might give them to Ian. That afternoon, we got a call that Ian had made bail like the detective predicted, and within an hour, Isabel's phone started blowing up with messages from aunts and cousins saying Ian was telling everyone she was destroying the family. Isabel showed me the texts with shaking hands, one aunt calling her selfish, a cousin saying she provoked Ian by touching their mom's room, another relative saying she was killing their dad by putting him in a facility. Dr. Zhao had arranged for their dad to go to a rehab place for 2 weeks while the lead got cleaned up, but he kept asking why he couldn't go home and didn't understand why Isabel was keeping him away. We met Detective Rollins at the courthouse the next day to file for an emergency protective order, and he helped us fill out all the paperwork, explaining every question and making sure we included all the details about the hammer attack. The judge read through everything and granted it immediately for 2 weeks based on the evidence, telling the clerk to have it served to Ian right away. The order said Ian had to stay 500 feet away from Isabel, me, and their dad, and if he violated it, he'd go straight to jail. Rollins gave us both his card and said to call immediately if Ian showed up anywhere or tried to contact us through other people. More relatives started calling Isabel to say she was wrong for getting the courts involved, that families should handle things privately, that their mom would be ashamed of her for putting Ian in the system. Isabel stopped answering her phone except for me, the detective, and Francine, but the voicemails kept coming from family members saying she needed to drop everything before it was too late to fix this. Detective Rollins called me the next morning asking if I could bring my phone to the station. I met him there and he plugged it into their computer system to download all the photos I'd taken of Isabel's injuries over the past months. He pulled up each image on his screen, zooming in on the bruises and cuts, taking notes about dates and times. Isabel arrived with her phone too and had even more pictures, including ones from when Ian broke her wrist last year that she never reported. The detective's face got darker looking at each photo, especially the ones showing fingerprint bruises on her throat. He said he'd gotten the neighbor's doorbell camera footage that caught all the screaming and the sound of things breaking. The neighbor had saved everything from that day plus 3 other times Ian had shown up drunk and violent. Rollins played part of the audio for us, and hearing Ian's voice threatening to kill Isabel made my hands start shaking again. He told us this was one of the strongest cases he'd seen with this much evidence. That afternoon, Ross Bradford came to the station to give his statement about Ian at work. Ross sat in the interview room telling the detective how Ian had been drinking on job sites for months, getting more aggressive with everyone. He described how Ian nearly killed a coworker the week before with a sledgehammer over who got to use the nail gun first. The guy only survived because 3 other workers pulled Ian off him. Ross had written everything down, dates and times of Ian showing up drunk, threatening people with tools, punching holes in walls when things didn't go his way. He said the whole crew was scared of Ian, but the boss wouldn't fire him because he was one of their best workers when sober. 2 days later, Isabel got a text from the sheriff's office that they'd served the restraining order to Ian at his apartment. The deputy had to bang on the door for 20 minutes before Ian opened it, still drunk from the night before. They made him hand over his hunting rifle and 2 handguns right there, which he fought about until they threatened to arrest him. Isabel showed me the notification on her phone confirming the order was active, and she could finally breathe a little easier. That same week, I started having problems I didn't expect. Every time I heard hammering from the construction site near my apartment, my whole body would freeze up and I'd start sweating. I couldn't sleep without checking the locks on my door 5 or 6 times, then getting up to check them again. My doctor said it was normal after what happened and gave me anxiety pills to help me sleep. She also gave me a referral for trauma counseling, but the first appointment wasn't for 3 weeks. Isabel was dealing with her own crisis because the rehab place called saying her dad had to leave in 5 days. His lung condition meant he needed special medical equipment and round-the-clock monitoring that most places couldn't provide. The only facilities that could take him cost $3,000 a month after Medicare. She started going through her mom's jewelry box, trying to figure out what she could sell. Her mom's wedding ring might bring $800. The pearl necklace maybe $500. Isabel spread everything out on the kitchen table, crying as she sorted through each piece, remembering when her mom wore them. The prosecutor called Isabel that week to discuss the case and mentioned Ian might not go to jail. She explained that first-time assault cases often got plea deals, especially if the defendant agreed to treatment programs. Ian could get 2 years probation with mandatory anger management and alcohol counseling instead of prison time. Isabel didn't know how to feel about it because part of her wanted him locked up, but another part hoped he'd get help. The prosecutor said the decision wasn't final yet and depended on Ian's lawyer and the judge. My medical bills started arriving and I nearly threw up when I saw the total. The emergency room visit was $4,000, the CT scan was $2,000, and all the other treatments added up to almost $8,000 after insurance. The hospital gave me forms for victim compensation funds, but warned the approval process took months and might not cover everything. I had to start a payment plan just to keep them from sending it to collections. Meanwhile, the lead abatement companies came to look at the house and their quotes made everything worse. The cheapest estimate was $15,000. The most expensive was $22,000. They explained that lead paint removal required special equipment, full containment of the area, and certified disposal of all the toxic material. Isabel started researching state programs for emergency repairs, but most had waiting lists or didn't cover lead issues. She spent hours on the phone getting transferred between departments, filling out applications that might not even get reviewed for weeks. While going through more of her mom's things to sell, Isabel found a wooden box in the closet she'd never seen before. Inside was a letter in her mom's handwriting dated a month before she died. The letter talked about wanting the bedroom repainted in soft yellow and green, colors that would bring life back to the space. Her mom wrote about how the dark walls made her sad, and she hoped someone would brighten them after she was gone. Isabel sat on the floor sobbing, realizing her mom would have supported everything she was trying to do. The next morning, we took the letter to show Detective Rollins and Francine at their offices. They both read it carefully and said it would help show the judge why Isabel was in that room that day. Rollins made copies for the case file and gave us the originals back. Francine said the letter proved Isabel was honoring her mom's wishes, not destroying her memory like Ian claimed. They would use it at the upcoming hearing to show Isabel's real motivations for trying to fix the room. 3 days later, we sat in the courthouse waiting room with our hands shaking, while other people went in and out of different hearing rooms. Isabel kept checking her phone to make sure her dad's aide knew where we were in case something happened. The bailiff finally called our case number, and we walked into the small courtroom where Ian was already sitting with his lawyer at the other table. He looked smaller somehow, wearing a suit that didn't fit right, and he wouldn't look at us even when we walked past. The judge read through all the paperwork while we sat there sweating, then asked Detective Rollins to explain what happened. Rollins stood up and described the attack in detail, showing the photos of our injuries and the damaged room on a screen. The judge's face got harder with each picture, especially the one of the hammer hole in the floor next to where Isabel's head had been. Ian's lawyer tried to say it was a family dispute that got out of hand, but the judge cut him off and asked if he'd seen the medical reports. She went through each injury, asking the doctor who'd treated us to confirm the damage. After an hour of testimony and evidence, the judge extended the restraining order for a full year, saying Ian had to stay 500 feet away from Isabel, me, and their dad. Ian's face went red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm to keep him from saying anything. We left through a different exit while Ian had to wait inside for 30 minutes, so we could get away safely. That same afternoon, Ian's union rep called Isabel to say they'd put him on unpaid leave until the criminal case was done. His employer sent a letter saying he couldn't come back without finishing substance abuse treatment first. Isabel found out from a cousin that Ian was already behind on his truck payment, and his landlord was threatening eviction. The financial pressure was hitting him hard, which his lawyer said might make him more willing to take whatever plea deal the prosecutor offered. A week later, Ian's lawyer told the prosecutor that Ian would enter a 30-day inpatient program at a treatment center 2 hours away. The judge made it a condition of his bail, so he didn't have a choice about going. Isabel cried when she heard because part of her hoped maybe he'd get better, even though she was still scared of him. She kept saying their mom would have wanted him to get help years ago. While Ian was in treatment, Francine called with good news about the emergency state funds for the lead work. She'd pushed the application through the system and gotten approval for $12,000 toward the abatement. My victim compensation also came through for $5,000, which wasn't everything but covered most of my medical bills. The relief of not drowning in debt made me cry in my car after opening the letter. The professional crew showed up at the house wearing white hazmat suits with special breathing equipment that looked like something from a movie. They put up plastic sheeting to seal off the hole upstairs and brought in machines that created negative air pressure. Isabel couldn't watch them work because it made her think of that day, so I went to supervise and make sure they got everything. The crew chief showed me how they had to wet down every surface before scraping to keep the lead dust from spreading. They worked for 3 days straight, filling special containers with all the contaminated material. While they worked on the lead, Isabel and I started packing her mom's things from the rest of the house. We found photo albums, her mom's wedding dress, jewelry that had been hidden in shoeboxes, and cards from every birthday and holiday. Isabel wanted to keep the meaningful stuff, but knew they couldn't store everything. We donated clothes to the women's shelter and gave furniture to families who needed it. Each item we packed felt like we were finally honoring her mom's memory the right way instead of keeping a poisoned shrine. After the crew finished and the inspector cleared the house, we brought Isabel's dad to see the room. The walls were sealed and painted fresh white, ready for the soft colors his wife had wanted. He stood in the doorway for a long time, then walked in and touched the walls with shaking hands. Tears ran down his face as he told us he'd known the lead paint was dangerous for years, but was too scared of Ian to do anything about it. He kept apologizing to Isabel for not protecting her, for letting Ian hurt her all those years. 2 weeks into Ian's treatment, the prosecutor called with the plea deal offer. Ian would get 2 years probation with mandatory counseling, weekly alcohol monitoring, and $10,000 in restitution payments. If he messed up any part of it, he'd serve 3 years in prison. The prosecutor needed our victim impact statements before the plea hearing, so I sat at my computer trying to write about that day. I described the sound of the hammer missing my head, the terror of being trapped in that small room, and how I still couldn't handle being in tight spaces. I wrote about the nightmares where I'm back in that room and can't get out, the medical bills that ate up my savings, and the therapy I needed just to function. Isabel wrote her own statement but couldn't finish it without breaking down. She asked me to help her explain how she just wanted to save their dad, how she still loved her brother but couldn't trust him anymore. Meanwhile, Isabel found a support group at the community center for people dealing with violent family members. The first meeting was hard because she had to say out loud what Ian had done to her, but then she met other siblings who'd been through the same thing, choosing between family loyalty and staying safe. One woman had testified against her brother and hadn't spoken to half her family since. Another man's sister had nearly killed his wife, and he still struggled with guilt about getting her arrested. They all understood the weight of loving someone who hurt you, the confusion of wanting them to get better while needing them to stay away. The plea hearing happened 3 weeks later, and Isabel asked me to come with her, even though my shoulder was still in a sling from where Ian's hammer had grazed it. We sat in the back row of the courtroom watching Ian in his cheap suit standing next to his public defender, while the prosecutor read out the charges. Ian had to stand up and tell the judge exactly what he did that day, his voice cracking when he admitted to hitting Isabel with the hammer and threatening to kill her. He said he was drunk and angry about their mom's death and took it out on us, and the judge made him describe each specific act of violence while Isabel gripped my good hand so tight my fingers went numb. The judge accepted the plea and told Ian he was getting 2 years probation with mandatory anger management and alcohol counseling. Plus, he had to pay $10,000 in restitution split between Isabel and me. She explained that any violation of probation meant automatic prison time, no second chances, and the no-contact order would stay in effect the entire time. Ian nodded and said he understood while his lawyer wrote everything down, and then the bailiff led him out through a side door without him ever looking back at us. I started physical therapy the next week for my shoulder, doing these painful exercises with rubber bands while the therapist kept asking about my range of motion. The counselor my doctor recommended was this older woman who had me walk through the attack over and over until I could talk about it without shaking. She helped me understand that there was nothing else I could have done to protect Isabel, that I'd already risked my life trying to stop Ian, and the guilt I felt about not preventing the attack wasn't rational. Meanwhile, Isabel's dad finally agreed to sign a healthcare proxy, making Isabel his official medical decision-maker, after his doctor explained how close he'd come to dying from lead exposure. He sat in his hospital bed with tears running down his face, apologizing to Isabel for not protecting her from Ian all these years, saying he'd been too scared of his own son to stand up to him. Isabel just held his hand and told him it wasn't his fault, that Ian's drinking and grief had turned him into someone none of them recognized anymore. The social worker at the hospital helped arrange for a home care aide to start coming 3 times a week once he got discharged, someone trained to watch for signs of elder abuse who had a direct line to adult protective services. The aide was this tough woman named Maria, who took no nonsense and immediately started organizing medication schedules and doctor appointments while teaching Isabel how to properly monitor her dad's oxygen levels. Isabel and I sat in my apartment one night eating takeout and made each other promise we'd never try to handle something dangerous alone again. We both got those security systems with panic buttons that connect straight to 911, and Isabel had extra locks installed on every door in the house. The prosecutor called a month later saying Ian's counselor had sent a letter through their office because Ian had written an apology, but the no-contact order meant he couldn't send it directly. Isabel stared at the sealed envelope for a long time before putting it in a drawer, saying she wasn't ready to read whatever excuses he'd come up with. By then, the house was completely different, with fresh white paint covering all the walls, new locks on every door, and special air filters to make sure there wasn't a trace of lead dust anywhere. Isabel's dad could finally breathe easy and started spending whole afternoons in the living room watching game shows instead of staying in his bedroom all day. The inspector came back for a final check and gave them a certificate saying the house was completely safe, which Isabel framed and hung in the hallway like it was a diploma. 3 months after the attack, I realized I'd slept through the whole night without waking up in a panic or needing the anxiety medication my doctor had prescribed. The nightmares were getting less frequent, and I could actually go to work without jumping every time someone dropped something heavy. My boss had been really understanding about letting me work from home when I needed to, and adjusting my schedule around therapy appointments. Isabel called me crying one afternoon, but for once it was happy tears, because her manager had pulled her aside and promoted her to team lead after learning everything she'd been dealing with. The promotion came with a big raise that would cover her dad's home care costs with money left over for the first time in months. She said her coworkers had been incredible, covering her shifts when she had court dates, and even starting a collection to help with her legal fees. The first restitution payment came through the next week, $500 that helped cover some of my medical bills, with Ian required to keep paying that amount every month for the next 20 months. It wasn't really about the money, but knowing he had to take responsibility for what he'd done, that there were real consequences he couldn't drink away or pretend didn't happen. The prosecutor's office sent another update 3 weeks later saying Ian had finished his 30 days and moved into a sober living house on the other side of town with 10 other guys in recovery. His counselor had to send monthly reports to the court, and the first one said Ian was going to his required AA meetings every morning at 7 and participating in group therapy 3 times a week. Isabel found out through their aunt that Ian got a sponsor who was making him work through the 12 steps and write in a journal every night about his feelings instead of drinking them away. The sober living house had strict rules about curfews and random breathalyzer tests, and Ian had to get permission just to go to the grocery store. Meanwhile, the first restitution check arrived for $500, which covered part of my emergency room bill, and Isabel used her portion to pay for her dad's prescriptions. The court clerk said the payments would keep coming every month for almost 2 years, and even though it wasn't huge money, it meant Ian had to stay employed and couldn't just disappear. Isabel's dad started getting stronger once they moved him back home to the lead-free house, and his lung doctor said his breathing tests were improving every week. He could walk to the kitchen without his oxygen tank and started doing crossword puzzles at the dining table while Isabel cooked dinner. The home care aide taught him exercises to rebuild his strength, and he was actually laughing at old sitcom reruns instead of just staring at the wall. One evening, Isabel's cousin Maria showed up at the door with a casserole and an apology, saying she'd been wrong to blame Isabel for breaking up the family. Maria admitted she hadn't understood how bad Ian's drinking had gotten, or how dangerous the lead paint was for their dad. 2 more relatives called that week saying they wanted to help with doctor appointments and grocery runs after hearing the real story from the prosecutor's report. Isabel cried when her uncle offered to pay for a cleaning service so she wouldn't have to do everything herself anymore. My physical therapy sessions went from twice a week to once a week, as my shoulder got its full range of motion back. The therapist showed me strengthening exercises I could do at home, and after 2 months I could lift my arm over my head without any pain. My regular therapist said I was making great progress processing the trauma, and we moved from weekly appointments to every other week, then monthly check-ins. I helped my neighbor fix her fence one Saturday, and didn't panic when she brought out a hammer, which felt like a huge victory. Isabel surprised me by signing up for volunteer training at the domestic violence hotline after her support group leader mentioned they needed Spanish speakers. She went through 40 hours of training on safety planning and crisis intervention, learning how to help other people escape dangerous situations. Her first shift was scary, but she said it felt good to turn her nightmare into something that could save someone else's life. The training coordinator said Isabel was natural at it because she really understood what callers were going through. 5 months after the attack, we were sitting in Isabel's kitchen while her dad worked on a puzzle at the table, and she was making enchiladas for dinner. The walls were painted the soft yellow her mom had picked out years ago from a paint sample she'd kept in her jewelry box. Her dad was telling us about the birds he saw at the feeder that morning and asking if we wanted to watch Jeopardy with him after dinner. The house smelled like cilantro and onions instead of dust and fear. Isabel had hung her mom's favorite photos back up, but in new frames and added pictures from healthier times. The 6th restitution payment had just cleared, and my credit card debt from the medical bills was finally going down. Isabel's work insurance covered most of her dad's ongoing care, and the raise from her promotion meant she could afford the copays without stress. Ian's counselor sent another update through the court saying he'd stayed sober for 5 months and got a job with a moving company that didn't involve construction sites or tools. He was still living at the sober house and attending meetings, had finished step 4 of his program, and his sponsor said he was actually doing the work instead of just going through the motions. The no-contact order was still in place for another year, but Isabel said maybe someday far in the future they could have a conversation, though she wasn't ready to think about that yet. Her dad didn't mention Ian anymore except to ask the lawyer if the restitution was still coming on time. I went back to helping friends with normal stuff like painting bedrooms and installing shelves without my hands shaking or needing to check exits. Isabel kept volunteering at the hotline every Tuesday night and started leading support group sessions for Spanish-speaking survivors. We'd learned that getting help wasn't weakness and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you couldn't handle something alone and call for backup before it was too late. Makes you wonder, right? All those years of medical records might have been the one thing that left Dad's lawyer completely quiet during cross-examination. Like the video, it helps more than you think.